Well, there's nothing I like to see more than a full house at Tillar House. Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Anderson, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Society of International Law. And those of you who are new to ASIL, we are a membership organization of those interested in international legal issues. We have about 4,000 members from all over the world, and we're dedicated to promoting greater understanding and use of international law. And we do that through our publications, meetings such as this, our annual meeting, and so on. And would welcome your membership and involvement in any of our interest groups and activities. We're very pleased in the past year and a half in particular to have a series of programs that have been focused on women and conflict, women in international law. We've been focusing on that in no small part due to the initiative of our current president, Lucy Reed, who I know is really disappointed not to be here this evening, but is with us in spirit. And under her leadership, we organized a meeting that looked at implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325, about to hit its 9th birthday, I think, this weekend. We have co-sponsored an event that brought together the prosecutors of the international criminal tribunals to look at the role of women in international criminal law. And tonight we carry on in the same vein with this program looking at women in conflict and the rule of law. And we're really thrilled to have the leaders, frankly, in this field, the people who have blazed the trail in this very important area. And I'm going to leave it to our interest group co-chair for our interest group on rule of law, Melanne Civic, to do the introductions. But I do want to thank Melanne for her initiative on this program and in many that she has organized for that interest group. So welcome to Tillar House, and I'll turn it over to Melanne to introduce the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy, and welcome to all of you. I'd like to thank ASIL for hosting this event and for our co-sponsors for helping to make tonight happen. Our co-sponsors are USIP, Vital Voices, Inclusive Security, Women in International Security, and the National Association of Women's Lawyers. I would also like to thank the collaborative input of the two ASIL interest groups, Transitional Justice and Rule of Law, and Women in International Law. This evening, we're most fortunate to hear from two leaders in the field, as Betsy mentioned, Ambassador Melanne Verveer and Ambassador Swanee Hunt. Both have extraordinary impact in advancing women's rights through public service and founding landmark women's advocacy non-governmental organizations. Now we are at an exciting intersection of women in leadership roles and women's issues coming to the fore in the international arena, with the next 12 months benchmarking numerous historical advancements in women in peacebuilding, with 6 distinctive commemorations and achievements. This month begins the countdown to the 10th anniversary of the UN Security Council 1325 on Women, Peace, and Security. Resolution 1325 was passed unanimously and was the first resolution ever passed by the Security Council that specifically addresses the impact of war on women and women's contributions to conflict resolution and sustainable peace. This December marks the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, adopted in 1979 by the UN General Assembly and described as an international Bill of Rights for women. June marked the first year anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1820, which recognizes that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. Beijing Plus 15, commemorating the 15th anniversary of the Beijing World Conference on Women, is coming up in February 2010, with the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action critically important to bringing issues of women and peace building into the forefront of international discussions. Earlier this month, the Security Council reaffirmed its landmark 1325 resolution through the unanimous adoption of Resolution 1889, calling for a wide range of measures to strengthen the participation of women at all stages in the peace process and condemned the continuing sexual violence against women in conflict and post-conflict situations. It urged member states, UN bodies, donors, and civil society to ensure that women's protection and empowerment was taken into account during post-conflict needs assessment and planning and programming. In August 2009, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton traveled to the Eastern Congo to speak out against the systematic rape of girls and young women as a weapon of war. The Secretary has made the fight against mass rape a major theme in foreign policy that focuses on the plight of women in the developing world. In September, the United States took its seat on the UN Human Rights Council and pushed, with others, for the creation of a new mechanism to address discriminatory legislation against women. A resolution was passed without establishing such a mechanism, but nevertheless, the groundwork was laid for its future establishment. This evening, we will examine women in peacebuilding and rule of law from the top down and the ground up. We will look at the connections between international law and principles and domestic legal and justice systems, and the tensions between traditional and state law systems and women's participation in human rights. What are the roadblocks for women's access to the peacebuilding process? Are there steps that can be taken to remove legal obstacles for women to become more involved in peacebuilding? I would like to ask the distinguished panelists 3 guiding questions as they make their remarks. What role do women have at the grassroots level in peacebuilding and strengthening the pillars of justice and rule of law in fragile states? What distinctive value added do women provide to peacebuilding and restoring or creating rule of law, to the creation of peace agreements, to the development of DDR programs, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, and to addressing transitional justice issues such as rape as a weapon of war? And in cultures resistant to a strong role for women, in what capacity and at what point in the processes should women participate? And what are the potential initial destabilizing effects of women's participation? Each of the panelists will speak for approximately 15 to 20 minutes about these issues and recommendations for next steps. Then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. I'd like to introduce both ambassadors at this point. Ambassador Melanne is Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues. The President's decision to create this position is unprecedented and reflects the elevated importance of these issues to the President and this administration. Ambassador Vivier previously served as co-chair and co-CEO of the Vital Voices Global Partnership, an international nonprofit that she co-founded. Vital Voices works to expand women's roles in generating economic opportunity, promoting political participation, and safeguarding human rights. Prior to her work with Vital Voices, Ambassador Vivier served as the Chief of Staff to then First Lady Hillary Clinton in all of her wide-ranging international activities and to advance women's rights. Ambassador Swanee Hunt is President of Hunt Alternatives Fund, which promotes social change, focusing on strengthening women's leadership in conflict regions and combating sexual trafficking. Ambassador Hunt also chairs the Washington-based Institute for Inclusive Security, including the Women Waging Peace Network, which advocates for the full participation of all stakeholders, particularly women, in peace processes. At Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, Ambassador Hunt is the Eleanor Roosevelt Lecturer in Public Policy and founded the Women in Public Policy Program, a research center concerned with domestic and foreign policy, which she directed for more than a decade. Ambassador Vivier, would you like to take the platform?
Thank you, Melanne, and this evening may be momentous in many ways, but I can assure you there has never been, nor will there probably be, another time when 2 Melannes are gathered any place. Because I have gone through life never knowing another one until she appeared in my life several years ago. I am delighted to be here at ASIL, and I guess I should start with an apology, which is not a particularly positive way to start. But I was to be here many months ago, very, very early. I haven't been in this job very long, but I think I was supposed to be here after 3 weeks in the job or something like that. And it is because there is such a strong lobbying force at the State Department for anything to do with ASIL. I think everybody there must be a member. But I couldn't make the first engagement. And then for the second one, it was the very day that the Secretary of State was in New York speaking on behalf of Resolution 1888. And I thought, well, if I had to miss it that day, everybody here would truly understand. So I'm glad to finally be back here. And I'm particularly pleased to be here with Ambassador Hunt. Swanee and I have known each other a long time, and I know how much she has brought to this issue personally and will continue to. She became engaged as ambassador to Austria. That wasn't enough of a job for her. She took on promoting women in the Balkans through the terrible conflict there and ensuring through many, many difficulties, many ups and downs, that women had a place at the table. And nobody played that role as well as she. And she has since devoted her life in many ways to this issue, not confining herself to the Balkans anymore. And you know, when she first started her organization, it was called Women Waging Peace, which I love very much because I thought, well, this really captures it. Women do wage peace. And then it was changed to inclusive security, which if you really think about it, that is the message tonight in many ways. And it is that we cannot have security, do security, work on security, consummate security, unless it's inclusive, unless women are really involved. So thank you for that, Swanee, and for always framing these issues so well for all of us. I have been reflecting a good bit lately on the unfinished agenda of the UN Fourth World Conference on Beijing because, as the other Melanne said, we are ramping up to the 15th anniversary. Then First Lady, now Secretary of State, said in her keynote address in Beijing at the time, "It is time for us here in Beijing and for the world to hear that it is no longer acceptable to discuss women's rights as separate from human rights." She then proceeded to intone a litany of abuses against women, from dowry burnings to domestic violence to rape as a tool of war. And she preceded each one by saying, "It is a violation of human rights," and punctuated all of this with that statement that echoed around the world, that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. Over 180 countries gathered in Beijing, along with thousands and thousands of NGO activists, and the officials adopted a platform for action. It was a very ambitious blueprint that covered 12 areas from education to economic participation to women in peacebuilding. Now, much has been accomplished since then, but our work is far from done. And tonight's conversation is about one aspect of that that is yet far from done. We have an unfinished agenda. And as you've heard, during the last couple months, the United Nations has taken some very important steps to strengthen the existing UN tools that we have had to address sexual violence as a tactic of war, and to reassert the importance of women's roles in conflict resolution and peacebuilding. Now, the fact that these new resolutions were needed demonstrates how much work remains for us to address, to establish that link in a very activist way between maintaining international peace, security, and preventing and responding to sexual violence used as a tool in armed conflict, which is what as you heard, Resolution 1820 was all about. But work also remains to ensure that Resolution 1325, which spelled out that women be full participants in peace negotiations, conflict resolution, and peace building, also be realized. So let's take women in peace building. When the now Secretary of State was First Lady, the United States was very engaged at the time in trying to end the long sectarian conflict that was taking place in Northern Ireland. And she worked, and it was part of our commitment as George Mitchell and the President and the UK Prime Minister and the Taoiseach in Ireland, and everyone were working to try to achieve an end to this. She worked with the women. And they told her so much about what had transpired over many years, how they were losing their sons, their brothers, their husbands, and nothing was changing. And they began to come together across this divide that nobody was coming across except to do each other in. And the first tentative steps they took didn't have to do with bringing peace to Northern Ireland. It had to do with the price of children's milk, which neither side could afford. And so they joined together to try to keep the price of milk from going up. And in the process, they began to create an incredible social infrastructure to address the many challenges that they were confronting in their society. They were not welcomed by the political parties. They started their own party, the Women's Coalition, because that was the only way that they could engage the political process at the time. That party is no longer, because now there are women in all the political parties in Northern Ireland. And I remember, as I stand here, the day women came from the Women's Party to the White House. The men were all being seen by the president, and it suddenly occurred to the foreign policy folks that, oh my gosh, we've got the Women's Coalition here and no one's seeing them. So I got a call. Do you think the First Lady would meet with them for 5 minutes? So, needless to say, she agreed. And after about 2 hours, she heard chapter and verse about how hard it was to engage the process and what they needed, and how they needed to have the kinds of things, as they put it, women in America have had: access to the tools to build their capacity, to learn from each other, leadership skills, communication skills, how to be effective. And it was at that moment that there was a Vital Voices Democracy Initiative that Swanee had a great deal to do with starting in the State Department. And she said, let's bring those kinds of resources to the women in Northern Ireland. And it was a lot of American women coming together to do that. The women managed to win a seat in the peace talks. They made an incredible difference on many issues that may not otherwise have been on the agenda of those peace talks, human rights among them. And when the Good Friday Accord was finally adopted, they were the ones who worked so hard to ensure that the referendum would pass and that it would come to fruition. And after many, many trips to Northern Ireland, to the point where today they are helping influence women in other parts of the world who are dealing with their own conflicts, they have taken their place, not just having influenced the process, but in many ways, through economic engagement and through the political process, they are building the peace and holding the peace and continuing to make the difference. That is an example of what women can bring to this process. Now, we have so many other examples. We are all aware of the courageous role that the women of Liberia played to end the conflict there. Some of you may have seen the film Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which has the stories of many of the market women, very simple women who said enough already. And it was their version of, we shall not be moved. They were not going to be moved until steps were taken to end this terrible conflict that they were going through. The women in Rwanda have played an incredible role in rebuilding that society post-conflict, to the point where today they have more women in their parliament than any country on the face of this earth, and they have a lot of women in very strategic positions in their government and in their economy. So not too long ago, as we are being so engaged on these issues, and we were working on the DRC situation, I had a conversation with a foreign policy expert who said to me, as I was talking about the importance of women in the peace process in 1325, and he looked at me like I was from some planet that didn't understand the world, and he said, I don't get it. There are these women, they're not part of the armed militias, they're not part of the governments. Why would they have to be in peace talks? And, you know, it completely misses the point that they are the glue in society, knowledgeable of what's needed and where this process has to go if a peace is ever going to hold. They are, in many instances, the victims who've been through it more than many of the people at the table who were perpetrating it. So this is something that needs to happen in a way that has greater force than it does today. Now, Resolution 1325, if you don't know it, and we all throw these numbers around, calls for the appointment of women, more women, as special representatives of the Secretary General. It calls for the expansion of the role and contribution of women in UN field-based operations on the ground. It recommends that all personnel involved in peacekeeping receive training on protection, rights, and needs of women, and of the necessity of involving women in peacekeeping and peacebuilding measures. It recognizes also the critical importance of accountability for criminal acts and the needs to end the culture of impunity. Now, as you heard, we are marking the 9th anniversary, but next year makes it a decade. And I would say that before the celebrations, we really need to make 1325 more than what it is today, because there are too few women involved in peace negotiations. Women comprise only a small percentage of high-level negotiating teams, and there has never been a woman chief mediator appointed by the UN. So we can and we must do better. And we must do our part to increase the number of women in peacekeeping and peacebuilding operations, and ensure that the training our country provides to the military and police forces in combat areas continues to be sensitive to women's needs, and we have been doing a considerable amount of that. So we know that when women are included, they are instrumental agents in fostering peace and sustaining peace. Now, Resolution 1820 established that link, maintaining international peace and security, that critical link between that and preventing and responding to sexual violence used as a purposeful tactic to destroy women, their families, and ultimately their communities. The international community has made some progress. Many peacekeeping mandates in Chad, DRC, and Sudan, for example, include requests for strengthened efforts to prevent and respond to sexual violence. In 2007, India took the lead and deployed a 125-member all-female police contingent to Liberia. Swanee has spent a lot of time there, and I'm sure she probably knows each and one of them personally. But they are part of the UN mission there. And these women are not only contributing to the stability to peace and security in Liberia, but they have also served as a model to women in policing and have inspired Liberian women to become police officers themselves. And we are trying to get more women engaged in this way in the process. But I regret to say, and many of you know this in terrible detail, that the atrocities and the mass rapes are continuing. And in the eastern DRC, It is reported that there are about 1,100 rapes every month. The physical and emotional damage to individual women and their families from these attacks cannot be quantified, nor can the toll on their society. When the Secretary went to DRC, I was with her in Goma. She met with the peacekeepers. She had a roundtable with the NGOs, who are extraordinary leaders with tremendous capacity, who need to be more strategically engaged. And she went to the camps. Many of these camps have now been evacuated, but they were dismal places with thousands of people in a very small area, and people who were very insecure because they were not safe there by any means. But one of the most really extraordinary moments was listening quietly to a victim who is probably an example of just how torturous the situation is. And she said to the Secretary that her husband was taken out of the house and shot, and 2 of her children were shot. And then these armed militia came into the house, killed the other children, and raped her in ways that are beyond anything any of us should ever imagine, a nightmare of brutality, and left her for dead. And when you hear something like that firsthand, and know that it is not an isolated situation, and it is a tactic that is used over and over to achieve the goals of those who are perpetrating it, we need to do more. In DRC and so many other places, the perpetrators of this kind of violence go largely unpunished, and the impunity encourages further attacks. So as we sit here tonight, the violence goes on despite our collective efforts. And it is clear that the international community needs to make more of a collective response. And one way, among several ways that we are trying to address this situation, was when the United States introduced a resolution in the Security Council to improve the UN's response to sexual violence committed during armed conflict. And on September the 30th, the Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 1888. And what it does is something many in the NGO community have called for. It identifies specific steps that the United Nations and member states can and should take to improve the UN's response to sexual violence committed in situations of conflict, calls on the Secretary General to appoint a special representative to lead, coordinate, and advocate for efforts to end sexual violence. And we expect that that person should be engaged at the highest levels with civilian and military leaders to spearhead the UN's activities on this front. It also calls on the Secretary General to rapidly deploy a team of experts to work with governments to strengthen the rule of law, address impunity, and enhance accountability before these kinds of terrible situations occur. Now, we are all working hard to try to ensure that a very good person with outstanding experience is named to this position, and that we have a pool of experts who can begin to make a difference. Let me just end by saying a word about CEDA, because I know how much and extensively ASIL has been engaged in this effort. It is a priority of this administration, once and for all, for the United States to ratify CEDA, the convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. We are standing alone with a few pariah states in not having ratified. Much of the world cannot understand this, and neither, frankly, can I. But it is something that I think often affects our credibility. And we were asked, well, what difference does it make? There are a number of countries who've ratified CETA, and look at the state of women in their countries. But I know firsthand that had it not been for the ratification of CETA, many of those activists would not have the leverage that this provides them to wage the efforts that they are making every day to advance women's progress. We are all committed to the full and effective use of all the multilateral tools and resources at our disposal to free women from violence, to include their voices in peace building and the pursuit of international security, and to work towards women's empowerment. Because the problems women face are fundamentally a manifestation of their global inequality, our solutions must cross countries, must cross all kinds of boundaries and all kinds of borders. The empowerment of women is a global goal, and it is a means, and one of the most effective means, that we have in our arsenal to advance global stability and prosperity. The question is whether we are able to achieve equality for women in the end, and that is a question really about the type of world we would like to live in. So women's rights are human rights, and we cannot settle for anything less. Thank you.
Gee, Melanne. Oh, there are all these people over there.
There are.
I know, what do we do about them? All these people that we can't see. If I can't see you, that means you can't see me, right? Shall I come over here? I'll just stand over here. Sure. Would that be better for you? Is that better? Okay. Okay. Well, Melanne, when they ask you and me to come speak, like you could have said whatever I have here, and I could have said what you have there. We've worked together so long. We met in '92. Yeah, and we're older. Our friendship is older than 1325. I know. I promise you, we're much more successful. Right. We actually have the same style as well as the same understanding about what's been going on in the world, and even the same way that Melanne moves in and out of the talking about the various Security Council resolutions and what was happening historically during these times. She also gave you behind-the-scenes looks at a lot of how that policy formation was happening, and Melanne is really the person. Ambassador Revere is the person who brought me into that whole diplomatic world, and I will never forget that and the good time we had working on the transition back when. I would like to go back then again into some behind-the-scenes looks, if I may, and tell you some stories, because I believe that we do better to show and not just tell. And so in 1994, as the ambassador mentioned, I was in Vienna, and I ended up hosting negotiations that attempted to turn the three-way war in Bosnia into a two-way war. Now, you'll recall there were three warring parties in Bosnia. Bosnia was about one-third, one-third, one-third Bosnian Croat, Bosnian Serb, and Bosnian Muslim, if you want to identify them by religion. They call themselves the Bosniaks now. So it's very, very hard to deal with a three-way war. And so the State Department had the idea, well, let's get two of the sides together, and then they will be able to face off essentially against the Serbs, because it was, by most accounts, almost all accounts, a war of aggression by the Serbs. And about 90% of the human rights abuses have been documented as having been at the Serb hands. So I wasn't the negotiator, but I was the host. And that those negotiations were successful. There were 2 rounds. And let me get over here. Hi, how are you? So there were these 2 rounds of negotiations. And then we had the signing here at the White House, at the OEOB. And I was there, and there was President Izetbegovic and President Clinton and President Tudjman. And I looked out on this sea of people, all the negotiators from the different teams, and I realized, they were all gray suits. And I thought, how did that happen? I mean, I consider myself quite sensitive about women's leadership, and I could tell you, 15 different things I had done as ambassador to really push the voices of women, blah, 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 blah. And here, it just hadn't, not only had it not dawned on me to do anything about it, to insist, I didn't even see it. It's like all these negotiations were going on. I'm here, I'm there, back and forth between these rooms where the negotiations are happening. I have them all over the house, the residents, to try to loosen things up, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't even notice that it was all men. And when I mean all men, I mean all men. Yeah? And I thought, wow, well, I guess I don't really understand the culture. It must be culturally insensitive for women to play professional roles like that. And come to find out, Yugoslavia had the highest percent of women PhDs of any country in Europe. I mean, you had to work at not having women on those negotiating teams. So I was really impacted by that. So then afterwards, I came to the Kennedy School, where the dean was Joseph Nye. Many of you have read his books. And I was having lunch with him, and he said, and I told him this story, and he said, Swanee, you should look at that. Because as I think about it, I don't remember seeing women in negotiations. And so I did. I went to the UN. I said, this could be an interesting question. So I went to the UN, and I said to this UN official, how come there aren't any women on the negotiating teams in Africa? And this UN official looked at me and said, well, Ambassador Hunt, the warlords refuse to have women because they're afraid they'll compromise. So I thought, well, bingo. I mean, can you imagine? Can you imagine if you were able to prevent a war? I mean, can you imagine if we had prevented Iraq? I mean, can you imagine if we'd even shortened it by 1 month? I mean, seriously, how many wells could we drill for clean water around the world? How many children could we educate in what we spent in 1 month in Iraq? It's profound, really profound. And so out of that came this idea, why don't we gather together women from a lot of places? We can't just have, women from 4 African states, because then it'll seem like, oh, aren't those African women great, So we had women from 10 different conflict areas. We had 110 women. And Mickey Yachevich, whom some of you know, who's right back in the... Stand up, Mickey. You're such a hero here. He was one of the original organizers here. We decided we would gather all these women. Now, I talk women, 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 and I want you to know that I do recognize great men when I see them. And one of those was Ted Kennedy. And when we had our first gathering of these women, he spoke to 100 policymakers who came up to Cambridge from Washington, on their own nickel, by the way, except for the White House, which pled poor. And, and Senator Kennedy was always there for this cause. And I remember, in fact, when we brought a group of women here to Washington, and we asked him if he would host them in his office, these women from these conflict areas. He said, I'll do better than that. I will have some other senators there too, to co-sponsor it, and he got Kay Bailey Hutchinson. And I said, that's interesting. How did you get Kay Bailey Hutchinson? And he said, we take Spanish together. So, we're all thinking about, yes, that's right. We all are thinking about Senator Kennedy, aren't we, all the time now? So, anyway, I remember also that Joe and I spoke about the importance of these women coming together with these policymakers, and he said, this morning, I opened 2 different papers, the New York Times and the Boston Globe, and I saw op-eds by 2 of my faculty members. One, I have very strong disagreement with. And that was, he didn't name him by name, but that was Sam Huntington. The Clash of Civilizations. That was the New York Times piece. And then the other one was the one we wrote about women waging peace. And he said, it makes a very big difference how you frame your argument. Because, in fact, the way you frame your view of the world becomes self-fulfilling. And I do believe that. I think if I had one message for you today, it is that how we are in the world as policymakers, as people interpreting law, it's much more than words on paper. So much of it is what we bring in terms of our values, our belief sets. Do we believe in the power of working across lines? Or do we believe that these lines will define our work? And Joe and I saw in our bringing together of these women a new idea, an idea that had power. And it has been striking to me to see how difficult it has been in so many ways in the last 10 years for that idea to get traction. Now, we have lots of research now. We have all kinds of women. In fact, in our own network, which the women wouldn't give up the name, the Women Waging Peace. So they said, we're the Women Waging Peace Network, even if you are the Institute for Inclusive Security. Among these women, these 1,000 women, they are supporting each other. They're sharing their ideas. They've now moved up. They're now foreign ministers. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's president. So I think there are like 14 foreign ministers. So they're getting more and more power. But the idea among the policymakers, it is striking how difficult it is. It's like this framework that they have of it being this, that security is a guy thing. That framework is so thick. And so I applaud you for being here tonight and caring about figuring out how we at least make that framework more porous. So why is it? Why is it that it's been so difficult? Let me just tell you 3 ideas here. The first is this notion of women's issues. Now, after shock and awe, right? I was over at the Pentagon and tried to get there really fast to say, okay, you have an opportunity here. We've got Iraq, we've got chaos, which means, by the way, the good thing about war, there are very few. A good thing about war is that it turns the whole social order crumbles, and there's just this chaos, and there's an opportunity for change. And so I said, you've got that occasion now. And I was talking to this person highest up in the Pentagon who was working on the Iraq situation and calling all lots of shots there. And I said, okay, you've got to get the women in. And you asked us to address a whole series of issues. I talked about transitional justice. I talked about DDR. I talked about the grassroots. I said, these women have their fingers on the pulse of the community. They think outside the box. They'll cross lines working together. And I gave them a lot of information about all of these, the why women have to be so involved now. And he said to me, thank you so much for coming in, Ambassador Hunt. I really appreciate it. And we'll be certain to be in touch with you. And how am I doing, right? And we'll need to get the place secure, and then we'll be able to think about women's issues. And I thought to myself, but I was talking about security. Like, what did he think I was talking about? I said to him, I'm not talking about cervical cancer. I mean, seriously. Seriously. What did he think I was talking about? But he could not imagine it. He couldn't imagine that security was somehow going to be affected by the role of women. I mean, even if you just said, look, there are 51% of the population. Don't we want to draw from 100% of the talent pool? I mean, just on the face of it, you would have to say, let's be sure that we're looking at this group. Even if you didn't go into why they have these particular attributes. At any rate, the second, that's the women's issues piece. The second problem we have is, those poor women. Oh. Now, you all, I was on the board of USA for UNHCR for 11 years. I care enormously about the plight of the people who are suffering in the world. And I feel like I have to say that to you, lest what I'm going to say next takes away from that. My assessment is that the most powerful way that you can address the needs of those who are most suffering is, in fact, to elevate women into leadership. If you do that, you will have leadership that is particularly sensitive to people in need. And I'm not talking about one particular woman who makes it to the prime minister position, and she's the only woman in a triangle of a pyramid of men, and she has been more sharp-elbowed than any of those men to get to the top. I'm talking about when you have women in a mass, and they are her constituency when she gets there. Women in that kind of context, and we see this all the time in the research on women in parliament, when they get to the numbers of about 25, 30, 35%, the budgets shift. And much more starts going into healthcare and into education and away from weapons. And there is no better way to address, in my opinion, the most poignant and striking needs of the world than elevating women. For one thing, they'll care more, and then the second is you'll get solutions that are indigenous rather than coming in from the outside. So here's the dynamic. I went to see President Clinton in 2000 and said, look, the G8 is going to be hosted in Japan, and the Japanese want to do something on conflict prevention. This is a great moment to have a resolution about the importance of women in leadership. So he said, wonderful. And the State Department, of course, immediately calls and says, can you come over? And I'd been trying to get an appointment over there for quite a while, but suddenly I had one. And so we went over and we start talking about a resolution to this effect. And so I get the first draft. I say, I'd like to help with the drafting. They say, okay, but we'll do the first. So I get it, and it says, essentially, these poor women, there are so many civilian casualties, and so many of them are women and children, and it's just not fair because they didn't do anything wrong. I mean, this is lay version. I mean, I know you all are more sophisticated than this. And I wrote back and I said, no, I don't think this is the tone we want. You can say that later, but you can't lead with that or they'll never hear the women's leadership piece. So I got a second draft back from the State Department, and it started out, these poor children who have mothers who, it's just like, No, I don't think that's the point. No, come on. So we went through 3 drafts before we came out with something that you have in your seats, which does lead with, it's very, very important to have women's leadership. But I just want you all to know that there was a lot that went into the making of that sausage. Now, you would think that that's just an old story. But here's the bad news. I was last week with someone who is very up on this subject, and he was talking about Afghanistan, and he was asked by a group, what can we do about Afghanistan? Can we pull out? And he said, no, we can't pull out. We shouldn't send any more troops, but we can't pull out because of what the Taliban are going to do to those women. And so I took him aside, and we had some time, and I said, look, every time you start talking about women as victims, this happens. You get this dynamic where they never hear about women's leadership. And so he goes back out and he says, have you all ever been under a burqa? I mean, it's terrible. It's really terrible. And you can't see anything. It's so repressive. And then he looked at me and he said, and there's some women leaders under those burqas. I mean, again, I have to say the same thing. This is one of the good guys, just kind of like I was one of the good guys, in hosting those negotiations. It's really, really hard. I'm looking at you all as an audience because you all are very influential. You are writing very important documents. You're influencing many, many people. I'm begging you to write of women's agency, of their power, at least as a strong lead before you get into their vulnerability. And then the last, besides the women's issues and those poor women, and then I'll stop with this, is simply a lack of commitment. And I think that in a way, what shall I say? Of course we wanted 1325, but it was 9 years ago. 9 years ago. And if you ask people who care about how much of 1325 has been fulfilled in terms of what could have been fulfilled, people will say maybe 15%. There is something just cynical about putting the words on paper and saying, they're there, honey, we've done it for you. But it has that feel to it. And why did we need another resolution? And we all celebrated. Oh, good, we have another resolution. Then read the resolution, the recent one. It says, essentially, we really should implement 1325. That's what it says, right? And I was talking to Anwar Chowdhury. He was the ambassador from Bangladesh, and Bangladesh was the one that pushed through 1325. And he told me they had a trip to Kosovo just after 1325 passed, and with Security Council members. And when he looked at the schedule, it was all meetings with men. All. And he said, where are the women? We just passed this resolution. And they said, we would have, but there wasn't time in the schedule. And he said, I'll meet with them at 11 o'clock at night, and you tell me there's not time in the schedule. And on that same, in that same couple of months, I was there at the UN mission to Kosovo, and the women with whom I was working, helping them run for office, they said that they could not get a meeting with the special representative of the Secretary General who was running the UN mission, the SRSG. And by the way, 1 in 30 is now a woman. And they couldn't get a meeting. So I was having dinner with him, and I said, you've got to meet with these women. He said, I don't have time. And I said, well, let me tell you what they want to talk to you about. It's about the brothels of trafficked women that have sprung up because of the UN troops. And you've got to have a protocol that say that the UN troops can't go to these brothels. And he said, you're asking for the sexual repression of 10,000 troops. No. Now, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think he could have done that if 30 or 40% of his UN mission had been women. I don't think he could have gotten away with that. So those are the stakes that we're talking about. And whether it's inside of the UN system, whether it's people like me who are diplomats who are trying to do the right thing and we just are blind to what we're doing, or whether it's in the middle of a war zone, the same kinds of problems keep reappearing. This notion about women's issues, and that somehow this isn't security, and just the cynicism too. So let me urge you. I know we're going to have some time for Q&A. Let me urge you to be really careful as you in your work look for this issue, because it isn't necessarily going to pop out at you. You've got to look with different eyes and listen with different ears when you hear people talking about women's role in peace and security. Okay? Thank you.
Can someone from ASIL step forward for a moment so that we can pass the microphone around? Anybody? No? Okay. Well, I'll get up and be active then. All right, wonderful. Do me a favor and take the, you have a microphone for, okay, fabulous. We'll take about 2 or 3 questions at a time and then let the ambassadors respond. Yes? Yes, well, take this one for now. Thank you.
I think if you leave this door open, it helps too.
First of all, I will thank for the very good speech and insight on women in peace and security issue. It's really endear to people who are really living in insecure zones and dealing with conflicts such as Afghanistan, like for last 30 years. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Palwasha Hassan from fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace.
Can you all hear back there? No, here, come over here and use this mic and stand up here, Paul Washington. Come stand up here. I'm a teacher.
Thank you for being good teacher. I've been one of the women waging peace a member, and I visited the Colloquium in 2000. And I'm really inspired by the work Ambassador Swanihan was doing then and continues to do. It really translated to our work in our country, where I've been busy with refugees, and then since 2000 that I've went back to Afghanistan. I actually forgot what I was going to say. But one thing which is very important is like in countries like Afghanistan, where everybody knows us like for wearing burqa or chadari, and it's very important what you said. We are not all victims, and there are people who has sacrificed, but they stand for their rights and they continue to fight there. And recently there has been talk about negotiation with some of the warring faction, and especially those who has neglected and abused women's rights for years. And the groups such as Taliban and some of the hardline Islamic groups. And nowhere in any strategy which is spoken in here in DC or in Afghanistan, women are totally ignored in these talks. I don't hear anything about what is there for women. And it's not all women are wearing chadari, or it's not like women don't have any say about peace. There have been, from last 2 or 3 years, women are gathering in different places, including Kandahar, Kabul, and different places, and asking to be included in peace talk. And they want the process to be transparent. What is negotiated in there? So I want to see like what is the support that we are getting from you here in DC, because there is a great involvement of U.S. government in Afghanistan. What are you pushing to see women in peace negotiation in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take 2 more questions, and then the ambassadors can address directly. Let me see. No, over here.
I thought you pointed to the back. Oh, sorry.
Good evening. My name is Faida Mitifu. I'm the ambassador of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I've participated in some of the seminars at Cambridge, and
Ambassador, would you come forward?
Oh,
The people
front?
yes. People cannot hear you right now. It
okay.
worked last time.
Sure. Thank you. It's truly a great pleasure to be here. But I would like to come back to the point that both Ambassador Revere and Swani mentioned. The most important thing is to start at the grassroots level. And I love the idea of drawing strength and whatever you want to organize from the indigenous people themselves, because they had ways of preventing conflict, they had ways of resolving conflict, and if we can draw from that and strengthen their capacity and build from that, we had women who led. They led kingdoms, they led communities, and so forth. And at one point in time, all that kind of disappeared. So if we can draw back from that to build the capacity of women at the political level, strengthening their capacity to generate revenue, etc. I cannot get into all details. So as we work on this, we need to think about that. Rather than going from top to bottom, let's go from bottom to up. Thank you.
And one more question, please.
I'm just here as a guest. I just want to address and ask a question to have it incorporated more specifically on rape as a tool of war. You know, it was just perhaps a month ago, the Secretary of State was in the Congo and, you know, now Guinea. I don't have all the facts. I certainly have a lot of the emotion here. It seems like after almost 8 years of having very little done as a country, we have so many problems and so many issues that, and with the force of the media and the 24/7, that so many things can almost, you know, like be water on a rock, a slow erosion, but not like a volcano of reaction. And I just wonder if even something as objectively tepid as a House resolution or a joint resolution or something that women's groups especially, but joined by any right-thinking person could somehow focus on this without letting it pass. And also the fact that Guinea is a so-called state, if you will, it might lend itself more than these roving bands of people around Africa to specific sanctions and penalties, you know, which could incorporate the outrage of the world towards this activity.
Would you introduce yourself?
Pat McCarthy.
Thank you.
Well, let me start from the last statement and then go the other way. On the what is happening with this terrible continuation of rape, to say that we are making progress would certainly be an overstatement in any way. But there are steps that are being taken, and I think they're things that we should be heartened by. One is that several months ago, Senator Boxer, in her new role on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has a subcommittee that, in addition to human rights and other issues, global women's concerns are part of her agenda. And the first hearing she did in that subcommittee was on violence against women in Sudan and DRC. And I can tell you, just in my own personal experience and having testified at that hearing in conjunction with my colleagues from the Africa Bureau and from international organizations, an awful lot of activity has been moving forward, including the unprecedented, in some ways, trip of the Secretary of State to put a spotlight on what was happening. But that was only one action of all of the things that are going on, from trying to get at some regional solutions to, and the ambassador from DRC knows this well, to having those 5 commanders who have been raised time and time again as violators, using rape once and for all, having them pulled out of military operations and arrested and charged. And I hope we're getting close to that. It was an issue that the Secretary raised again, including assistance that is needed in many ways to build the capacity, not just to address the kind of horrific violence that's going on and the medical needs that the physicians are confronting, but to help women grow in terms of economic capacity and their ability to lead. And there is no doubt that in the worst of places, the most dangerous places, women are really developing a capacity and have a leadership ability, as the ambassador said, as the representative from Afghanistan said, to really make a difference. And I think that needs to be a part of it. On Guinea, I happen to know that there is a resolution, if it's not already going through the Congress, is about to go through the Congress, that goes to the very things that you stated when you stood up here, because enough already, and we have to call this for what it is. But I firmly believe that not until the perpetrators begin to be punished are we going to have a retardant effect. This is behavior that is condoned. There is impunity. You don't pay a price. And long after hostility cease, a lot of this still goes on. So we have a lot of work to get at creating justice systems in place of impunity. And really, and this is a lot of the United States support, is going to rule of law kinds of activities that go from helping the women deal with the trauma and the idea of raising the crime that's been perpetrated against them and participating in a process, to going through the whole process, getting convictions, and then putting these people in prison and not having them get out after 24 hours because, they know who to give some money to or who can take care of them. So this is not to overstate it or understate it. It is a complicated situation, but you're exactly right. We've got to keep a spotlight on it, or else nobody pays attention. If it's invisible, then it's not happening. And it is happening, so we have to keep it visible and address it. In terms of what you said, Ambassador, about the capacity of women in DRC, that is certainly true. And there is so much ability at the grassroots level. I mean, just imagine what the women are going through and what they're able to do every single day to keep body and soul together, to knit families together, to knit communities together somehow, and this amazing ability to address this in so many different ways. So I couldn't agree more with you. And when I was in Afghanistan not terribly long ago, just before the election, I spent several days there really to testify to the commitment of the United States to the role of women in Afghanistan, and to say absolutely that there is no way Afghanistan will embrace a better future without the full participation of women. Raise that issue with every leader with whom I met. And one night, in a conversation with several NGO leaders, the conversation started with an Afghan woman saying, "Please look at us as leaders, not as victims." And they are among the most talented people, greatly skilled, with great ability, and should be participating in every single way in the government. It would be vastly improved if they were, needless to say. And we are making many efforts, some of which I announced when I was there, to help to grow the capacity, help women to be more engaged in the government work, in the process that was taking place. But, I went way out to Badghis, which is far out near Herat, probably the poorest province and one of the most remote provinces. And even there, I left as inspired as I've ever been. The women were absolutely remarkable. Bless you. They were getting ready for the election. They were so committed to the process. There were more running for the Provisional Council than there was a quota for them to run. And if you could see the odds that they were up against, it would take your breath away. So we clearly, you are absolutely correct. Women's participation will ultimately make the difference, and we just have to drive that over and over again.
Thank you for those words. Where's Paul Basha? There, right in front of me. Thank you, thank you. I've had the privilege of being in Afghanistan since, off and on, since '98, actually. And seeing the shift there has been both exciting and then disheartening. And, you know, there's always this strong hope that we see. I have had the privilege of working not only with you and several of your colleagues, but actually bringing Afghan women to Brussels, where they spent 2 weeks working with not just the European Parliament and speaking there, but also with NATO. And from that relationship was formed then a working relationship back at the PRT level on the ground. And the Canadians really understood this, and they started having women who were in the PRT reach out to the local women leaders instead of having just the guys there who wouldn't be able to talk with the local women. And they started having regular meetings with them. This is down in Kandahar, right? I mean, a really difficult place. And when do you remember the jailbreak? Where was it? I mean, it was hundreds of Taliban escaped. The Canadians got a call from Afghan women with whom they had built these relationships 10 minutes before they heard from anybody else that there was something going on at the jail. Now, that is just, to me, a small example, in a way almost like a metaphor that we should carry around in our minds. That if you will connect with the people on the ground who really do know the price of a bag of rice. You know, I mean, they know, this is what I said to the guy at the Pentagon, you know, about Iraq. These women know where the disaffected 17-year-old boys are and whether they have a weapon under their mattress. You know, that's what women talk about. I mean, that's when we're doing, you know, when we're hanging our laundry out. You know what I mean, don't you? I mean, it's kind of a stereotype, but it's actually true. We know what's going on in each other's families. And that comes to have real public policy significance, believe it or not. In terms of your words about Congo, and first of all, it is delightful to see you again. I was thinking about my friends in Rwanda, where I've done a lot of work and watched how women came to be 56% of the parliament there, and the difference it has made. And it is a strikingly different place when it comes to unity and reconciliation. And since we have people here who are interested in the law and in grassroots, the gacaca, I assume most of you in this room know the gacaca, which was brought back in as the way to deal with transitional justice. You know, when you have 110,000 accused genocidaires and only 50 lawyers, you got to think of some other way. And that, so you release people back to their villages where there is this court, informal court, if you will, on the grass, which is what gacaca means. And women have led it from the very beginning. It has been almost totally women run, as has the Commission on Unity and Reconciliation. I mean, like the secretary and then the deputy, both have been women all throughout. So take a look at Rwanda and what women have done as they've gotten into the large numbers in the parliament is to create a massive campaign on gender-based violence. So if you want to get to some models for Congo, look right next door in Rwanda and see what the women leaders have done on gender-based violence. And I mean, it is a fierce campaign. Even 6 months before the law was passed in the parliament, the people around Rwanda thought it had already been passed because there was such energy in the media campaign and people out, the politicians going back to their constituencies, talking and talking and talking, civil society organizing against gender-based violence. So the last thing I'll say is that in Rwanda, it's not just about the parliament, it's not just about the gacaca. The court, which has 7 justices, 3 are women, including the Chief Justice. And I think when we look at Afghanistan and all of this business about, whether or not we're going to stay involved, well, are they going to have honest elections or not? I think we should be saying, and will they have women's real representation? Now it's 0 on their Supreme Court.
Ambassador Hunt, I know you have to leave to catch a flight. Do we have time for 1 or 2 quick questions?
We do.
Okay. 1 or 2 quick questions. Please introduce yourself and do keep your question brief, please.
Thank you very much. I am a Marine Reserve officer. I'm scheduled to deploy to Afghanistan next year, and I also work in the defense community, the policy, the defense strategy think tank community here in DC. And I appreciate your comments about how difficult it is to get the gender perspective at defense, because it's something that I might as well burn my bra in meetings rather than bring up gender and women as something that has to do with defense. So maybe can you talk about how we can it seems like state has sort of got it, that women count, and the development community has definitely got it, that women count. How can we get this into defense and get DOD and the military, the U.S. military, to see women's issues as something that they need to be thinking about and have projects on, just like they have projects on so many other issues? Thank you.
One more question.
Tried to speak very quickly, but about a year and a half ago, I met Mickey Yasevich at your organization, and I was pretty convinced then that you were my hero. And after hearing your speech now, I'm doubly convinced.
Oh, good. Say it again.
I'll move on to the next part.
Here we go. This one. Boom it out.
Great. All right. Who here loves Ambassador Swanee Hunt? For the past 10 years, I've been working overseas, National Democratic Institute, and training women candidates. Before that, I was the first male political director of the National Women's Political Caucus. And I remember not knowing anything about women's issues and going in and trying to understand this political environment, and how easy it was to work with NOW and NARAL and all these great women's groups, and how quickly they formed coalitions, and how this was just a magnificent way to resolve conflict and resolve issues in the community. Now, in 10 years overseas, what I've seen is the message of the National Women's Political Caucus, which was get women in the pipeline. And that seems to be an attempt made overseas through USAID and other donor organizations. But there's this conflict between quotas and mandatory minimums in everything from USAID and our policies and whatnot. And my question is, in the absence of any real policies and real changes happening, what's wrong with quotas? What's wrong with making mandatory minimums, or making gender not just a cross-cutting issue, but empowering the WID office and doing more things in that direction? Is there a balance that we can have in that regard and get that quota, get that 33%, the sustainable amount to make change? because it seems we're dragging our heels in this international development where we could be making a lot more progress quickly.
Let me take on the quotas. You know, the United States supported quotas both for Iraq and Afghanistan in their constitutions. I remember working with the first group of Afghan parliamentarians who were really very new to the process, and met with many of them when I was just there. It is amazing how impressive they are and what leaders they are, and there is no way they would be in parliament or the others would be in government today if it weren't for the quota. So quotas do make a difference, made a difference in Rwanda. It made a difference in most post-conflict societies where there was a process. For example, in Africa, the several of the countries that are at a 30% plus place in women's political participation are there because of quotas. So obviously, this is a big debated issue today. It's being debated because of quotas for boards, corporate boards. I mean, how do you break the resistance? And then once you have quotas, how long do you have them? I mean, I was with the Rwandans fairly recently who are so worried that if the quota doesn't continue, given the good news story they are in their country and for the world, what will happen? Will it change? Are people now accustomed to the difference women make? Now, we've got a little bit of evidence in India where in the panchayats, at the village level, they've got mandated quotas. There was first a lot of resistance, and the guys thought, well, you know, if my wife runs for this panchayat, she'll win, she'll have the quota, I'll take over and I'll actually do the work. Well, it didn't turn out that way. And the women have done an extraordinary job. There are several studies now that document the way they've used the resources, the public resources, how they've invested in education and in safe drinking water and in the kinds of things that the communities need. There are today more women running for the panchayat successfully than what the quota demands. So, you know, it is certainly a tool that has been highly effective. In terms of working with the military, I frankly have taken some considerable heart. We have a series of regular discussions on Afghanistan, for example, that is a total interagency process that includes significant military presence, participation, and these women's issues are on the table. And certainly in Afghanistan, the work that the military has done in the PRTs to advance a lot of the women's work, the military women have been together with the guys on this. I've had a lot of conversations in recent weeks with Iraqis who are really worried about what's going to happen because the military has been so supportive of many of the things that the women have tried to achieve in Iraq, and they're now worried what is going to replace that. And we're thinking very hard and trying to be very strategic about how that transition takes place without really making for new difficulties. So I do believe there is progress. I think there's a lot more we have to do. And one of the ways we're doing that is really sitting down with the key people and really working to move this forward. But there is a growing recognition of how important it is. And so just keep up your work.
Excuse me for standing. I just like to see. I'm just too tired. Are you too tired? Oh, I'm fresh as a daisy. Oh, boy, I'm so sympathetic with what you were saying about those rooms. I mean, I've been in them. And here's an idea. And that is, I think it's very difficult to say the W word. And if instead you talk about civil society, most of civil society has very, very strong women's leadership. And so it's a way to at least broaden the thinking. Civil society is still considered, I think, okay right? Although I must say, when the president became president and kept saying, no, we've got to send 17,000, was it 17,000 more troops into Afghanistan? And I kept thinking, good Lord, I mean, I'm not opposed to the troops going in. It was that, why isn't he talking about civil society, you know? Why is it all about the troops? Because clearly, if you're on the ground in Afghanistan, you know that there's a tremendous need for something beyond just troops. And so I was complaining about it to various people in the administration. They said, oh, well, I had two different people say this to me. Oh, well, he's actually saying and civil society, but the media is cutting him off. And I said, look, now wait, if that's the issue and he cares, then why wouldn't he say we've got to send in more civil society and troops, right? Well, finally I had a person who was, in the loop who said, no, obviously that's not it. We just don't think the American people will buy it. We think they'll still buy the idea of troops, but there's no way they're going to buy civil society. So we're going to get them in there anyway. They said, so that's one bit.
But Swanee, if I could just say,
Please.
there are a lot of civilians that are in Afghanistan to do this kind of civil society building.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's a complete either or.
Right. Okay. I just, it seems to me we are so militarized, and you've been there more recently than I have, and so I trust your judgment on that. And then in terms of the quota, right after, I went into the green zone, and I met with the head of the CPA, and I said, look, you've got a governing council that we have chosen. This wasn't thrust on us. We chose it. There are 24 members. Of those, there are 3 women. Now, how can this be when you really had complete control over this? And at first he said, oh, well, we couldn't, you've heard it, we couldn't find any women leaders. And I said, wait a minute, I can find the women leaders. Why can't you find the women leaders? Maybe it depends who's looking. And then he said, well, look, we're not going to have a quota. And I said, so I understand. We're allergic to quotas. Americans are allergic to quotas. So how did you decide how many Shia, how many Sunni, and how many Kurds to have? Did you just put names in a hat? You just drew them out of the hat? Well, of course not. Of course you may not have wanted to use the Q word, but of course you had a balance, this perfect balance you were going to achieve. So we play a lot of games with ourselves. And when it's something that we care about, we make sure that we have this kind of balance. And when it has to do with gender, whether it's the Democratic Party in this country or the Republican Party, we don't care much. We had an election, which was the big, amazing breakthrough in terms of diversity this year with the election of Barack Obama, regardless of your politics. It was an amazing breakthrough. Women went from 16% in the U.S. Congress to 17%. And the reason that happened is because we didn't care. And by the way, if you get all excited about the fact that 3 of those women senators are Republican but 14 are Democrat, that's not because of the Democrats. That's because of Ellen Malcolm. It's because of one woman who really, really cares about this and has put her life, on the line making this happen. So we have a long, long way to go as a society. And I'm not being partisan about this at all. It's really all of us. Now, we have to end more upbeat. And that is to say that if we, Melanne, why don't you and I just run the world? How's that?
Well,
I want to say something, and I hope I don't embarrass them, but there are several women here from Physicians for Human Rights. And they came to see me several weeks ago and presented me with a study of what's happening in the camps in Chad to women. It's not a happy story. But they had a page in the study that was an expression of how these poor, really illiterate women saw themselves in terms of who they were. And I was so moved by it, I said, you know, this should be a poster. And tonight they came with a poster. And I wonder if one of them would come up and just tell us what it is, because it is, it restores one's real understanding of the value of each person.
So this is the poster. This is the Farshana Manifesto that was created in June. This happened as a result of a group of 7 young women in the Farshana refugee camp in eastern Chad trying to make extra money to help feed their families, left the camp seeking work. Simply because of that, they were accused of being prostitutes, and a public beating was arranged by the camp president that went on for hours, and to the degree that all of the women had their arms broken and were severely injured. And some of the female leaders of the camp were so outraged that they created this manifesto. And here is what it looked like in Arabic, and we had it translated into English. But I guess I'll just call attention to the very last line. They're complaining of lack of equality, failure to encourage girls in school, early marriage, compulsory marriage, all these things. In the very end, they say, thank you, we hope to achieve freedom for women in the whole world. So even these women who are supremely oppressed feel that there is this sisterhood and that women everywhere need to join together.
I'd like to say another special thank you. Thank you so very much to Ambassadors Hunt and Revere, and thank you all for participating and being here tonight. Thank you.